Some characters rub readers the wrong way, and not just that evil masseuse character. Either intentionally or unintentionally, writers sometimes blunder into, "Can you stop messing with the lights?" Either intentionally or unintentionally, writers sometimes blunder into characters that their audience ends up despising. Sometimes a character readers are meant to love ends up being loathed instead. So to help you avoid that, we're going to talk about some situations that make readers really dislike a character, usually with characters that are supposed to be liked. These are not necessarily problems with the character themselves, but disconnects between the reader and the character, which causes them to be unliked. Most stories have a mixture of unlikable and likable characters. Problems arise when a character the reader should like is one they end up not liking. So this stuff that we're talking about today will help you avoid that. All right, thing number one that might lead to an unlikable character when you don't intend to have an unlikable character. The character is excessively preoccupied with something that the reader doesn't care about. Your reader is going to be interested, hopefully, in certain aspects of your story. There are going to be elements of it that they want to learn more about. This could be a plot question, this could be a world building thing, it could be a body that they want to know who murdered, could be how a relationship is progressing, anything that catches the reader's interest. You want the reader to have questions and feel like the story is moving towards resolution of those questions. Problems creep in when the reader is interested in different questions than the story is moving towards resolving, or has a different area of focus than the story does. This gets especially frustrating when a character's interest is different from the reader's, when the character is seeking answers to questions that are different than the questions that the reader is seeking answers to. You see this with one-note characters who only ever focus on one thing. It can happen with characters who don't respond in a believable way to certain story elements. We talked about fridging in a recent video. This can happen too, where the character doesn't respond in a way that the reader would expect them to respond to some kind of tragic event in the story. This can happen because of a poorly developed character. It might be that the introspection and character thoughts that the character is having aren't coming through in a clear way, or it's a sign that you've accidentally stumbled into something that's more interesting than your actual plot, and that's what the reader is becoming interested in rather than the thing that you want them to become interested in. You always want to make sure that what your characters are pursuing and what your overall story is pursuing is in line with what the reader expects, what the reader is curious about, and what the reader has unanswered questions about. Thing number two that can make characters unlikable, the character makes decisions that are hard to follow or understand. Good characters are unpredictable, not because they behave irrationally or at random, but because they are so complex and nuanced that predicting their actions or reactions becomes difficult. They are not so simple to be predictable. They have enough facets to their personality that add variables to any sort of calculation that the character makes. All that being said, if a character is too unpredictable, if they are so nuanced and so complex that the reader has a hard time understanding how that character thinks, then that's a problem. There's a sweet spot between having a character be so flat and predictable as to be uninteresting, and being so unpredictable or so nuanced that they can't be pinned down and they just seem like a random mess of characteristics to the reader. At that point, the character stops feeling like a person that we relate to and more like just a personification of white noise. Complex characters still have a framework that they operate within, and the reader should be able to understand that framework. It can be a very detailed framework of beliefs and attitudes and emotions and temperament, but the reader still needs to be able to understand it. A character needs to be consistently complex. They need to have some kind of threads that link who they are together. They need to feel like a person, not just a bunch of seemingly incongruent decisions strung together one after another. Thing number three that can make characters unlikable, they create needless conflict. Your story needs conflict. Characters create a lot of conflict, which is good. However, if it feels like a character is making too many problems for themselves or other characters without a good reason, then that can turn readers against them. This can happen in comedic stories where characters just constantly get into all sorts of hijinks to the point where it becomes tiring. Sometimes you want that in a comedy, sometimes it goes too far and just makes the characters annoying. You also will see this sometimes with characters who are always getting captured or blundering into stupid, obviously dangerous situations without realizing. You'll see this too with like angsty or flawed characters. Like, I really like Mad Men, and I think Don Draper is a really good character, but some of the decisions he makes through the course of the series just are like, it's like, really? Are we doing this again? You know this is bad. This feels like you're screwing up just because we need more problems in this episode. Anytime that a character creates problems in the story, the reader needs to feel like those problems are justified. If it's just to create more conflict and the reader catches on, they aren't going to like that character. They're going to start to find them to be annoying. The decisions your characters make can be illogical. They can misread a situation, they can do the wrong thing, but the reader should feel like they are justified in doing that wrong thing. Having characters make mistakes or blunder into problems too much without enough justification just to create more conflict is a surefire way to make readers not like that character. Thing number 4 that can lead to unlikable characters: the interactions or opinions of other characters are not in line with the actions of that character. It's like, sure, your protagonist is a womanizing, drunken a-hole who never works out but still has a six-pack, and yet they're adored by every person he insults throughout the entire story. I mean, he shoved an old lady, but he made a smart-sounding quip afterwards, so all is forgiven. He sucks, and you, the writer, love him, so now every other character must love him as well. Sometimes an author really likes a character. Sometimes that character actually isn't super likable. Sometimes the author decides to make all the other characters like or revere this character in spite of that. Sometimes the reader catches on to this. This gets into Mary / Gary, Sue / Stu territory, when you have a character who is held in high regard despite how they act. They have this weird influence on the world that makes characters respond to them in a way that just doesn't seem realistic. Readers will start to catch on to this when the opinions that they have about a character don't line up with how the other characters perceive that character. This happens when you have a fundamentally unlikable character who you're trying to shove into likability. And this means that the author has to bend the laws of social interaction and also shave a couple dozen IQ points off of all the other characters in the cast in order to make this work. Readers sometimes get on board with this, but a lot of times they don't. The problem is not how the character acts. The problem is the repercussion or the lack of repercussion for those actions. When those two things don't line up, when the opinions about a character in world are different from the opinions that the reader has about that character, that's when you start running into problems. And lastly, thing number 5 that can make readers dislike a character: the character is either too bad or too good. Nobody's perfect, except cats. Cats are perfect, as they repeatedly inform us. There was a time where audiences really wanted perfect, incorruptible heroes who were paragons of virtue and villains that were just satanic manifestations of people who mistreat drive-through workers. I think tastes overall have shifted towards a more nuanced view of good and bad. Very few people in the real world are purely good or purely evil. They always exist in sort of a gray area. Good and evil is really just a matter of perspective and what side you happen to be sitting on most of the time. Making a good character too good or an evil character too evil can be problematic. It makes both types of characters seem less developed and ultimately less realistic. Now, you can go too far the other way with this. A lot of attempted anti-hero type characters just end up being loathsome examples of humanity, and less commonly you can have a villain that might become too sympathetic because they aren't villainous enough. Any character should have a general trend between good or bad. You are going to have characters that the reader supports and characters that they don't support, but neither side of that dichotomy should be absolute. The reader needs to know who to root for, but it's a tendency towards good or a tendency towards bad, not a complete black and white one side or the other. Making the morality of different characters too black and white usually means you have poorly developed characters that ultimately end up being less interesting. Speaking of digressions, the digressions of this video are about to cease because we are at the end of it. So there you have it. I hope you enjoyed this video and found the advice in it useful. If you want to see more stuff like this, please check out all my other writing advice related videos. There are literally hundreds of them. Also, subscribe to my channel to get more content like this. As always, thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.